Hello, everyone. Great. I won't stand up because I think you can all see me, but if you can't see me, like me to stand up, then wave your hand and I'll stand up. I'm Dan Tomlinson. I'm your Member of Parliament as of the 4th of July this year, and it is a great honour to be a Member of Parliament. It's a fantastic job, and thank you to all those of you who voted for me. I'm very thankful, and even if you didn't vote for me, I'm thankful for all the wonderful messages of support and warmth that I received in the weeks and months since becoming your MP. Thanks to Andy for hosting this evening and to the church for welcoming all of us in. I know there's people here who are members of the church, but also people who've either been in touch with me about this issue or seen the news that I was hosting 2 events online and have come along. So thank you. I really appreciate it. And I said in the election campaign that the people in Barnet were very discerning and thoughtful and wise, and it's been proved by this debate and the conversations that I've had this week, and I'm sure will be reinforced again by the conversations and views and perspectives this evening. The reason I put these events on is because I am genuinely really conflicted about this proposed law, which is probably a big surprise to lots of people in the room, was maybe a big surprise to people who I met on Thursday who have strong opinions that the law should pass. I don't have a strong moral objection to it, in fact. I can see from people who I've met, from stories that I have been told, the real strong sense that people have that they want to have control at the end of their lives, and the immense suffering that people go through towards the end of their lives with particular illnesses. And I've heard, and I found it really powerful, the argument that people just want individual choice and control. And I'm also of the view that the current law isn't working. 650 people took their own lives each year who have a terminal illness. We can imagine in part because of the immense suffering that they live with. But at the same time, I do have some concerns, and prime among them is the impact that the change in the law may have on the extent to which people will feel additional pressure from society, from maybe feeling like there'd be a burden on the National Health Service or maybe even on their families to end their lives earlier than they may otherwise have done. And that is a concern for me. I value life. We all value life, and we've all, I'm sure, had experiences where our family members have been towards the end of their lives, and actually some of those moments and times can be really rich and full of love and really strong emotions. I've had that personal experience in my family. So there are lots of other sort of issues that people have raised with the bill and the broader political debate, and I'm sure some of you will raise them or want to discuss them this evening. I won't go into detail on my perspectives on every single aspect of the proposed law, because otherwise we won't get to hear from anyone else or from all of you. The final thing to say is I genuinely don't know which way I will vote on Friday, which is getting quite difficult because Friday is fast approaching. And I hope that whichever, and I said the same thing on Thursday, I hope that whichever way I do vote, that you will come to see through these events, through many remarks that I may make on the day or publish at the time of the vote, that I'm really thinking this one through. I'm not rushing into this decision. I'm taking the time to listen to and respond to the correspondence I've received and to host these events. So I hope that you can see that this isn't something that I'm taking lightly. I think this is it's a big responsibility to be thrust on me as a new MP, but I wasn't elected to shy away from making difficult decisions, both on the economy or what have you, but also on issues like this. So I hope that's a helpful opener for all of you. I think I'm going to pass on to the panel. Is that right now, Andy? Yep. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Dan. I'll get straight to it. The reason why I oppose this bill is because I believe the law is there to protect the most vulnerable in society. And I do not think this bill protects the vulnerable. Why? Well, it's ultimately because I've seen it. My mother battled with breast cancer for 5 years. She died just over 2 years ago in a North London hospice. Throughout her cancer treatment, and especially in the last 6 months, she was of little to no material benefit to society. She was very aware that the drugs she took cost the taxpayer thousands, if not tens of thousands of pounds. She took up a lot of very valuable NHS time when we all knew the waiting lists were stubbornly high. Those last 6 months that she lived were the most vulnerable 6 months of her entire life. And I can tell you for a fact that she felt like a burden because she said to me that she felt like a burden. What a lot of people supporting this bill will tell you is that each person should have the right to make their own decision about how to end their life. What I think they do not realize is that this bill will affect everyone. I witnessed my mother as she mentally prepared to see her oncologist each month to find out just how long she had left to live and what the side effects of the drugs would have on her. She put her life in the hands of her doctor time after time again. For that doctor to turn around and say to her in that most vulnerable of vulnerable moments, "Why don't you consider killing yourself?" is not something I believe should be on the statute books of this country. Actually, her situation was rather fortunate for a cancer patient. My mother had an unusually strong character. She had a loving family and friends. We were financially secure. We weren't faced by any other major crises at the time, and she had a good death, actually. Just imagine how much harder it must be to bear that burden to live if you suffer with depression, if you struggle to pay the rent, or if you live far away from a hospice, as far, far too many people in this country do. The pressure to kill yourself is not something I believe doctors should ever put on those people's shoulders. Even in Dignity in Dying's best case study, the US state of Oregon, 43% said a reason why they decided to have an assisted death was because they felt like a burden on their family last year. Each day of care she received in the North London hospice cost 850 quid. The cost to kill someone in Canada is about £350. The people pressured by this bill will be the vulnerable and the weak, and it will be every single terminally ill patient in the final months of their lives. And so I think, to protect the vulnerable, I do urge you, Dan, please do not vote for this bill. Thank you.
Good evening. I'd like to tell you the story of Mari. At 18, her father was diagnosed with terminal spleen to liver cancer and died 4 years later. She supported her mother through profound grief for the next 4 years whilst juggling a top career, new marriage, and senior UK faith responsibilities. Her mother was then diagnosed with terminal breast to brain cancer and died when Mari was 29. Having cared for both parents for 10 years at home, her marriage failed, her career ended, and her mental health was in shreds. After realising that every day counts, she retrained in psychology and volunteered in aid work across Africa and Asia for the next 20 years. Imagine her shock at also being told she too had to live for 7 years with her own terminal blood cancer. Some of you may have already guessed that Mari is at the centre of my name, Anne-Marie, and this is my story. Let's talk about compassion. Compassion in Latin, compati, means to suffer with. Someone else's suffering becomes your suffering. Christians believe Jesus exampled this when he had compassion on people and healed the sick. We are also called to be compassionate for the sick and vulnerable in our own society. Suffering demands a response from us. We are also meant to suffer and empathise with those who are dying. We can do this for the vulnerable in our family, neighbourhood, community and workplace. All people deserve dignity in life and death. We can do this, yet we do not have the right to end people's lives, as the sanctity of life is protected in the Bible, Quran and Torah. We need to protect vulnerable seniors, especially in palliative care. As of last year, people in England and Wales have a legal right to free palliative care to enable all people to have a dignified death. The majority of deaths are peaceful and calm, as pain can be well managed in palliative care, as I have witnessed over the last 4 years volunteering as a chaplain in a children's hospital here in Barnet. Requests for assisted suicide or euthanasia are very rare when people are well cared for. In the 11 years before this that I volunteered as chaplain at the Marie Curie Hospice, Hampstead, there were no requests for assisted suicide or euthanasia, as people were well cared for in a symptom-free, caring and controlled advocacy and spiritual needs environment, meeting all their needs. Even a friend of mine for over 30 years who had wished for assisted dying in Switzerland, yet did not wish this when his time came this summer, and he died naturally and his wife is still alive, although they both agreed to have assisted dying. As a psychologist, volunteering as a chaplain, fears of the unknown are often present, yet leaning on their faith or other belief systems can help. It is common to hear fears of losses of control or becoming a burden, which need to be discussed openly and addressed with carers, families, or loved ones as far ahead as possible. We know that the initial bill is expected to include the eligibility criteria of a mentally competent adult with a terminal illness of 6 months or less to live. As someone initially given only 7 years to live, I had a number of very uncomfortable conversations about how and when I would end my own life. Having had over 2 years more of life so far, imagine how wrong it would have been to have been pressured by well-meaning attorneys or friends who were not prepared to help look after me or help find me suitable care at my natural end of life. What is worrying about this bill is on grounds or conditions are likely to be expanded to cover mental health and other complex conditions, which produces a slippery slope of our vulnerable beings eliminated. Moving on to regarding the disabled, which of course I classify as now, it is common to see their loss of autonomy, ability to engage in enjoyable activities and dignity, which reflect a lack of the individual's care and seeing disabled people as fully able. We are also concerned about pressure to manipulate vulnerables, that there is coercion and abuse already in care homes and overstretched health facilities. The going to be doubly mentioned Oregon case, interestingly, 52% of patients in Oregon opted for assisted suicide, felt they were a burden on family. The disabled are underrepresented in employment and could be more gainfully employed or occupied. Finally, we see financial pressures from relatives. Society needs to protect the weak and vulnerable, yet relatives and unscrupulous doctors could claim a patient requested euthanasia. Financial incentives from relatives or inexperienced doctors could easily occur. Finally, the potential for a relative to fake a will and for it to come to light post-death, replacing the real will that the dying person created, is all too easy, as I personally witnessed this last summer. In my opinion, that our care and health sectors are not sufficiently robust to take on this bill at this time, if ever, is another very important thing we need to take into account. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Nicholas Herodotou. I'm a senior palliative medicine physician. So I have some experience in dealing with death and dying, since they jokingly call me Dr. Death in the hospital because I'm forever telling people that patient's dying. Now, I'm going to give you 3 reasons why I'm fundamentally against this bill being passed and why I believe it should never be passed. 3 reasons: moral, social, and ethical. And I'll explain those 3. The first one, moral. Every society in the world has a law against murder. Regardless of what religious background they're from, there's no country that we know of that has a law that encourages unlawful killing. That's because every human being has an innate worth in their life. We are not animals. So one of the arguments people espouse, there are only 2 arguments for assisted dying, by the way. The first one is, you wouldn't let a dog suffer, would you? I'm sorry to tell you, we're not animals. Why? Even Hippocrates, the pagan, who was the father, really, of modern medicine, one of his criteria was, do no harm. And that's a very important point, that each one of us have a sense of purpose and value. Life is precious. Death, unfortunately, is an aversion to life. It's an aberrant. You know, to lose your loved one is an affront to living. So life itself is what has dignity and what is precious. Secondly, the idea of a social argument. The reason I'm talking about this is that no one lives in a vacuum. If you choose, God forbid, to take your life and you live on a desert island with no family, the consequences to what you do has no impact on anybody else. Unfortunately, we live in a society where what one person does can have serious repercussions to those around you. Let me give you an example. If you say today, I've got autonomy, and this is the one main argument they try to use for assisted dying, my right to die. Well, let me say, if you say tonight, oh, I want to drive on the opposite side of the M25 because that's my liberty. Well, you may choose to drive on the opposite side of the M25 because you want to express your autonomy, but the consequences, unfortunately, would be, number 1, you're probably going to die. Number 2, you're probably going to kill other innocent people on the road at the same time. So one's autonomy does not equate to you doing what you want, regardless, because we live in a society where we must be careful what we legislate for. Because if the legislation causes more damage to other people, then that's not a good law. That's why I'm fundamentally against this idea of freedom. I want to give you a quote from the Times newspaper in 2018. This lady, unfortunately, lost her daughter at 18 years of age from an awful cancer. And in this article in the Times newspaper in 2018, she says, I dealt with my daughter's death with cancer because she had great palliative care. I held her hand. I said goodbye. I had love, and I felt at peace because I did my best for my daughter. But her husband, who was diagnosed with motor neuron disease, actually went off to Switzerland to be euthanized, and she was actually angry. Let me just quote this small point from her. And the man was Simon Pinner, who actually killed himself in 2016. This is what she says about her husband's assisted suicide. The abrupt nature of her husband's death had left her fuming. I'm quoting from the Times. But surely it is equally brave to live with an illness, a disability, to embrace vulnerability, and to accept that none of us really has that much control. So that's the second point. And lastly, the idea of ethical. Thank you. What do I mean by ethical? Isn't that the same as moral? On the contrary, myself as a palliative medicine physician and the palliative care team, we give true dignity in dying. Shall I tell you why? It's not dignity in dying. They used to be called the Voluntary Euthanasia Society. Did you know that? They changed their label. It's basically a chameleon. It just changes its color. Their agenda is still to open the door to everybody else, because you can't, for example, have autonomy just for terminally ill people. And what does it mean, being in the last 6 months of life? I spend most of my days given a prognosis. If you've got a dementia, when are you going to work out they're in the last 6 months of their life? Or you've got a chronic lung disease or chronic heart disease. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately. But in ethical terms, I spend the majority of my time in a hospital stopping futile medical treatments where we cause unbearable suffering to our patients. And that's why I'm talking about proper dignity in the natural end of a person's life. Let me give you one example of a patient I had. This man was in his 60s. He was married with a son who didn't have cancer, but he had awful, multiple complications of medical illness. He was so ill, he was on a drip, he was artificially fed, and he had the biggest bag I'd ever seen on his tummy, where he's draining over 2.5 liters a day of fluid coming out of a hole in his tummy. And he was so ill. Do you know what he kept saying to the doctors? Please let me die. He repeated it. They couldn't control the artificial feeding because it was making his kidney function worse. So they actually asked me to give an opinion. They wanted me to control his symptoms. The first thing I said to this gentleman, I said, sir, you have a legal right under UK law, providing you're not deemed to be mentally ill, to have all your treatments stopped so that you can die with dignity. He opened his eyes and he nearly cried. He said, you're the first doctor that's ever listened to me. So what I did is I got a psychiatrist to assess him, who agreed that he was depressed, but he had insight into the repercussions to stopping his artificial feeding. He was peg-fed. And we called the wife in, and we stopped the artificial feeding and sent him to a hospice, and he died within 5 days. But what was so moving is that he held his wife's hand, they were crying, and I was there with them. And there was a sense of peace, because this man was so ill, he would never recover from his condition. He died with dignity. That's why this bill should never be legalized. Thank you for listening.
Hello, I'm Susan Merritt. I used to work as a GP, so I've got experience of treating patients. I now work for a Christian charity called the Christian Medical Fellowship. As part of my role there at the Christian Medical Fellowship over the last number of weeks, I've had the opportunity to look carefully through this bill and also to discuss the bill with a number of doctors, some of whom share my faith, some of whom don't, but who have concerns about the bill. And so I wanted to bring today some of the concerns that I've heard from them and that I myself share. My two kind of main headline concerns about this bill are that it's the wrong intervention and that it doesn't protect the people that it needs to protect. I think it's the wrong intervention because, as we've been hearing from others on the panel, there are failings at the end of life. There are people who don't get the care that they need, but that is because there is a lack in palliative medicine in this country. There's a lack in psychological care, social care, and care for carers. There are interventions needed, and Dan, you mentioned that you want to have that conversation about how we improve things. And I would urge that this bill should not go through, but that actually that conversation should be opened up about how we improve those things so that we can care better for those who are being failed at the end of life. But I would argue that this is not the right intervention because actually it can have very damaging wider impacts, as well as the fact that if those other things were done, it would be much less needed. The damaging wider impact that I want to talk about is particularly the fact that, having read this bill, I'm convinced that it does not protect people from being persuaded towards assisted suicide, from having pressure put on them that pushes them towards it. The authors of the bill agree that to pressure someone to end their life by suicide is a terrible thing. They've put that in the bill. They say that if an individual does that, if they pressure someone towards going for assisted suicide, they should be convicted of an offence and face a jail term of 14 years. I agree. I'm sure many here agree with that. But sadly, I think that this bill fails to protect those people from such pressure. And in fact, I think it would even increase such pressure. I think it fails to protect people from direct coercion. So the bill says that there's lots of protections in it if someone's actually directly being coerced, so perhaps they're being abused by a family member and they're under coercive control, being pushed towards this. We know many elderly patients do face elder abuse, and that's not currently picked up. The bill actually says, and Ms. Leadbeater recently was interviewed, and she said, we have to trust doctors. It's doctors who will pick this up. So I feel particularly obliged to speak as a doctor on this point, to tell you that as a doctor, I've not been trained to detect coercive control. That's not a standard part of medical training in this country. And the bill does not require that the doctors should know the patient over a long period. It doesn't require that they should go to the patient's home or usual setting. It doesn't require them to meet the patient's family. It doesn't even require them to be a particularly senior doctor or a palliative care doctor or an elderly care doctor who has experience in these areas. All that it actually requires them to do is to sign that to the best of their knowledge, and I'm quoting, the patient has made this decision voluntarily and without facing coercion or pressure. And I'm sorry to say, having worked in the NHS, that will amount to very little more than simply saying, I didn't see any. I didn't see any coercion in the time that I was with them, which may have been very limited and may not have involved meeting the family, having any insight into the interpersonal relationships around that person. So I think this bill fails to protect from direct coercion. I also think the bill fails to protect people from pressure towards assisted suicide due to failure to provide other options. We've heard that there is a lack in other options. 1 in 4 people, according to Marie Curie, do not get the palliative care that they need at the end of their life, about 100,000 people a year. There is nothing in this bill that protects them from being coerced towards assisted suicide through lack of other options. This bill also does not protect people from pressure from within the NHS. I was actually shocked to read that this bill would allow a doctor to suggest this route to a patient who hadn't brought it up. They wouldn't be required to do so, but they would be allowed to do so. It explicitly enables doctors to raise the possibility of assisted suicide with patients, even though they haven't suggested it. And I know from working as a doctor that patients will regularly say, apologise to me, apologise to doctors and nurses, saying, I'm so sorry, doctor, for the resources I'm taking up, for the time I'm taking up. You know, I should have been able to cope with this better, or, you know, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if this is a big enough problem to bring to you. All kinds of those apologies are a reality in our daily life as doctors. And this bill doesn't protect people from that. In fact, if your doctor brings this up as an option for you, when doctors bring up options, you consider them. That is the nature of the doctor-patient relationship. So as Daniel eloquently described in the case of his mother, this puts a burden on every patient to now have to justify mentally why they should go on living, because the NHS, which we know is cash-strapped, which we know is under-resourced, is asking them to consider it or potentially doing so. And finally, I think this bill doesn't protect people from pressure, from societal change. The very existence of this bill would change societal expectations. Every dying patient now having to justify themselves. As we've heard from Oregon, one of the best examples always put forward, over the 5-year period, half of people saying feeling a burden is a reason that they're choosing this. What would be put forward as offering a choice all too quickly becomes an expectation and a duty. So I would argue that this bill is the wrong intervention. We want to reduce suffering at the end of life, and there are means by which we must do that, but it's not through this bill, and that this bill places patients at an unacceptable risk and fails to protect them from pressure to end their life through assisted suicide.
Thank you. Okay, do you want to say something? Yeah. You use that to ask a question. You ask a question.
I'm going to, if it's okay, I'd love to ask a couple of questions before we hear from others. Is that all right?
Yeah,
I'm assuming Andy's right. Like, just give me a microphone.
No.
Thank you.
3 minutes. You got
3 minutes. I'm told the light's going to go on or whatever. Right. That was all sort of really good of you to share your professional and personal experiences, particularly, your story and the story of your mother. That must be very difficult to talk about in public. And thank you for sharing and sharing your professional experience as well. 2 questions, because you can tell I'm really wrestling with this. The first is around the current law, and I'd be interested to know, in broad terms, if you think it's working well at the moment. Because I think one of the things that people who want to see a change in the law will say is that the current system, if someone takes their own life or is pressured into taking their own life, the only point at which we investigate it, at which people get involved in thinking about whether there was coercion, is after the person has died. Whereas in the proposed bill, even if you may have concerns about the ability for 2 doctors and a judge to be able to be effective judges and decision makers, at least there are people who are checking in on pressure and coercion before someone ends their life. Whereas, at the moment, as I say, I believe it's the case that 650 people each year with a terminal illness take their own lives, and it's only after that they've left us that there's any check for coercion. So to me, I don't think the current law works very well either, but so I'd be interested in your perspectives on that. I think actually that one.
I wasn't sure. Okay. Okay, so in answer to your question, first of all, I think the law as it is actually extremely good because it has safety netting. When you talk about this bill having so-called 2 doctors and a judge, I'd be interested to know where you're going to get these 2 doctors from. I mean, the people trying to see their GP have to wait weeks. So how on earth are you going to extrapolate 2 doctors out of nowhere? Oh, please come and assess this patient for assisted dying. And, we need a judge. Well, there's a huge backlog, isn't there, in the courts? I mean, isn't it sort of 1 to 2 years before they see a judge? So how are we going to then pick up a judge to come and give an assessment? This is really utterly nonsensical. We have a good law. Why change a law that protects the vulnerable? This law will not protect the vulnerable. It will make them more vulnerable.
So I'm not a lawyer, as discussed, a GP, but my understanding is that the Suicide Act 1961 does make it an offence to encourage someone to commit suicide. So you're right that I guess we're not properly picking up on every case where somebody's doing that and where they could face repercussions that they should face if the patient is being coerced. I think I would argue that it's the same pressures on the public sector rather than the law that is the problem there. Because actually, if they did have a chance with a terminal diagnosis, people should be seeing their GP regularly. If we know someone's got a terminal diagnosis, of course they should be having access to regular appointments with their GP. And if they're more complex, to access to, the Macmillan nurse if they need that, to the hospice if they need that, to have professionals who are regularly engaged with them. And that would actually give the opportunity for these things to be more talked about, more conversations about the fears that this person is having, which may alleviate some of those fears which are leading people towards suicide, and actually may treat some of the reasons why they're moving in that direction, but may also enable people to pick up on some of the subtleties of something like that that's going on. So I'm not sure that the law is the problem. You seem to be talking about people finding out that this coercion is happening, and I don't think the change in the law would improve that.
Isn't that because the law is as it is at the moment, as in we only investigate whether someone was pressured into ending their own life now, once they've gone? And the best way to find out whether someone's being pressured is probably to talk to them, but you can't in the current system. That's just, I'm not saying this is like the be-all and end-all for me, but I think that's just one of the things I've been really, really wrestling with at the moment.
I guess it's true if they never talk to a professional about it beforehand. That means there's not an opportunity for a professional to pick up on it. That is true. But I think if we were well engaged with patients who were facing these worries, we would have the opportunity to talk to them about them. And I think patients, if their doctor was a trusted person that they knew well, would bring up that they were feeling this way at the moment with the current law. I think the problem is that they don't have that relationship with a professional.
Well, we've heard from lawyers, because I know lawyers here that have said there's absolutely no way they'd have any time to do this. We've heard from a doctor as well. We've heard from the hospital context as well. So the only bit left I can see is from the patient's perspective as well. Nobody ever asks me how I'm doing mentally. They ask me to check on my cancer. I think there is absolute lack of counselling and mental health support in this country. And medication is not the be-all and end-all, but nobody manages my medication. Nobody asks. I have about 8 silos of conditions that have come directly from my cancer, and I manage those. But nobody asks how I'm doing as a person. I actually choose to tell people how I'm doing as a bit of a safety net myself, but it's horrifying how easy it would be for me to euthanize myself, whether or not that made my friends and close people feel it was a tragic fault that has fallen upon them. But the system doesn't offer me anything else. So I think that's where the bit of the system is gone. We've heard 4 different aspects here that are lacking. The law isn't one of them.
Thank you. I think that people are always trying to draw parallels as to how assisted dying works abroad, but we have a parallel that we can draw in our own NHS already, which is the use of the do not attempt CPR, which I'm sure was seen as a compassionate thing, which was introduced, that some older people really might want, and might be glad to have on their notes. But the fact is that because this is seen as a treatment decision, a treatment option for people, the patient does not have the final say in whether it's on their notes. It's supposed to be discussed with them, but that often becomes coercive in my experience with my own mother. Coercive, the doctors coercing the patient that CPR is not a good idea. And the patient has no veto. It's possible to place do not attempt CPR on a patient's notes without their knowledge if it might distress them. If you don't think this is true, it's up there on the NHS website for anyone to see. I feel like that's a proper parallel because it shows you how something will work in our own NHS. And I'm very concerned that it could happen to us. There are hundreds of other reasons that I'm against it, but that's a strong enough one on its own for me.
Can I just quickly answer that question for you? Because there's a big misunderstanding about DNA CPR or do not attempt resuscitation. First and foremost, it is a medically led decision. It's what a clinician does. So if I'm asked to see a patient, I will have that conversation with the patient and give the reasons why we're not going to do it. By default, everybody is for resuscitation. That means if your heart stops working or your lungs stop working, they would, if you like, jump on you and try to bring you back. If somebody has an advanced, incurable, progressive condition where the chance of them recovering is going to be virtually 0, you do not want to inflict, for example, an elderly dementia patient who is very frail and she has a cardiac arrest, and that DNAR form is not signed, the medical teams on call will jump on that person. So if that's your frail grandmother, they're going to jump on her, probably break her ribs, and make her into a worse state. That's why we sign it. It's nothing to do with accelerating people's death. It's a clear medical decision. The family can ask for a second opinion legally. They cannot legally refuse it. You can legally refuse a treatment, but you can't demand a treatment that's deemed not in their best interests. So they will often ask for a second opinion, so they will get me to come along and say, I completely agree. It's inappropriate because to inflict an added procedure that will cause more suffering than good, you don't do that. That's bad medical practice. And in countries where they don't sign do not resuscitate forms, they will literally treat them to death, unfortunately. And I'm really sorry to hear about perhaps the bad care your mother got and they didn't explain it clearly to you. It's very important it's explained to the patient and the family why they're signing it.
Okay.
I think the challenge with the current law is that if someone takes their own life, it's only investigated whether someone put pressure on after they've gone. Well, you could, but it would probably end up being something like what people don't want to see in the current law, which is doctors and judges being involved. And I just don't quite see how that would work, because you'd have to find some way to proactively reach out and find people who are thinking about this. I think the people who want to see a change in the law would argue that at least if the law was changed, it would bring that conversation out into the open. It would mean that people would then have a discussion with the doctor about what they're considering, rather than at the moment there's no engagement with anyone when they're in this space about these issues until after they've taken their own life.
Right.
Well,
Doesn't
exactly.
matter.
I suppose,
Exactly.
Dan, you could ask the same question about any suicide at any stage of life. So some of those will be coerced, and we would want the opportunity to prevent those, along with all the other reasons why people are committing suicide. So actually better suicide prevention at all stages, both for coerced and non-coerced suicides, is what we need. Yeah.
I think what we're hearing... Just one brief comment. I think as a chaplain, I see chaplains around Beachy Head and all sorts of different places around the country. I think mostly staffed by volunteers, actually, like myself. So I think we're under-resourced in suicide prevention. I've got people that build bridges that are actually volunteering in their evenings to help man the bridges, if you like, or monitor the bridges. I think what we might be talking about two different catchments groups. The people that actually choose to take their own life in suicide, maybe we're going to do it anyway, quietly and privately, and the people that are would be taking their own life in the way you would be saying are a completely different catchment group. I don't think we can say the two are extrapolated to be the same. It's not factual. It's not researched and the same population. So I don't think we can actually make that as a extrapolation.